This is a demonstration of exercise 330, compute measures for Dupont disaggregation analysis, and the problem tells us to use the information below for 2018 for 3M Company to answer the requirements and to perform the computations from the perspective of a 3M shareholder. So the first thing that the problem wants us to compute is return on equity. Now when we look at the information that we're given on 3M, we notice that we have net income consolidated and net income attributable to 3M shareholders and total equity and then equity attributable to 3M shareholders. Now this means when you have two different amounts that there is a small proportion of 3M's consolidated equity that belongs to non-controlling interest. So since the problem asked us to compute the ratios based on the perspective of the 3M shareholder, when we compute return on equity, we want to use net income attributable just to the 3M shareholders and compare that to the equity attributable to the 3M shareholders. So that will be our first computation that we're going to make. In our numerator, we'll have net income attributable to the 3M shareholders, and in the denominator, we'll have the average equity attributable to the 3M shareholders, the beginning and the ending equity divided by 2. And then we see that return on equity is 50.09%. So we're earning net income that's equal to 50% of our average investment by our 3M shareholders. The next part of the problem states to compute the Dupont model components for profit margin, asset turnover, and financial leverage. So the Dupont disaggregation analysis breaks down return on equity into these three components. The first component is the profit margin. So to compute the profit margin, we're going to use our net income consolidated, and we're going to divide that by our sales. Now we use the total net income consolidated because we have total sales. We see that our profit margin is 16.37%. So that means that we're earning net income of 16.3% of our total sales. The next component is the asset turnover. So the asset turnover tells us how efficiently we are generating sales based on the average assets. So in our numerator we would use sales, and in our denominator we are going to use our average assets. So we'll take our beginning assets and our ending assets and divide those by 2. And that tells us how well we are generating sales from our investment in assets. And then the next component is the financial leverage. So for the Dupont disaggregation analysis, to compute financial leverage, we take our average assets, beginning and ending, divided by 2, and then we divide that by our average equity, and we're going to use our total equity because we have in our numerator our total assets. So our beginning and our ending equity divided by 2, and that gives us financial leverage of 3.4694. So that it tells us the amount of our assets that are being financed through our equity, but it gives us an idea of how much of our assets are actually being financed through debt. Because remember that financial leverage goes up as this number is smaller and this number doesn't change. So the amount that our assets are being financed by debt, financial leverage increases return on equity. It magnifies our profit margin and our asset turnover, but also remember that leverage has risk involved in it. The more that we finance with debt, the riskier we become because those interest payments and principal payments are contractual. We have to make those payments. The next ratio is return on assets. So to compute return on assets, we take our net income consolidated and we divide that by our average assets. Beginning and ending assets divided by 2. And this tells us how are we doing, or how much net income are we generating based on the investment in our assets. So we see that return on assets is 14.4. So that gives you an idea of the overall investment. How well are you generating income based on your total investment? The next part of our problem is to compute the adjusted return on assets, assuming a statutory tax rate of 22%. So our adjusted return on assets is going to be how much net income did we earn before our interest expense and taxes. So the first thing we're going to need to do is we're going to need to determine what was our tax shield. So our tax shield is equal to our pre-tax interest expense times that 22% statutory tax rate. What does that mean? Our tax shield is the amount of tax that we are saving because that interest is deductible on our tax return. Okay, so we have our pre-tax interest expense, but what we really want is our after-tax interest expense. So how do we get that? We take our before-tax interest expense and we subtract out that tax shield, the amount that we are saving on our taxes because it is deductible, to get to our after-tax interest expense. Okay, now we're going to take that after-tax interest expense and we're going to add that back to our consolidated net income, because our consolidated net income is after interest expense and after tax. But we can add back our interest expense after our taxes to get an idea of how much are we actually generating in operating income, and then divide that by our average assets to get our adjusted return on assets. So we see that our adjusted return on assets is 14.83%, which is higher than just our regular return on assets. And that is the conclusion of the demonstration for exercise 330.